She didn't go out to die. She only wanted to forget. But the moment she lifted that third drink to her lips, a tall man in a black suit gently took the glass from her hand and said, in a voice calm yet threaded with danger, "You're not doing this to yourself tonight." The lights in the bar in Lower Manhattan were warm and amber soft, the kind of glow that made people feel a little prettier, a little less broken. Music throbbed low beneath the noise, couples laughed, glasses clinked. A perfectly ordinary Friday night for everyone except her. Claire Thompson sat alone at the counter, her fingers locked around the stem of her glass as if it were the last thing left in her control. Her phone screen was still lit, showing the same picture she had stared at for 3 long hours. Her former fiancé, Nathan Green, kissing her closest friend right there in the apartment Claire herself had paid to decorate. The betrayal wasn't just romantic. It was financial. It was humiliation. It was everything collapsing at once. She had been laid off from her company last week due to budget cuts. The wedding deposit was gone for good. Rent was coming due. And now there was no one left beside her. So she did what many broken people quietly do. Went out, drank hard, hoping alcohol would outrun the sorrow. The first drink burned her throat. The second began to numb her edges. And the third was meant to erase everything. And in that exact moment, a man stepped into her life, without knocking, without warning, without asking. If you're still listening and something in this story presses gently against a place inside you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Like and share this video so we can keep bringing you stories filled with feeling every day. And if it isn't too much to ask, may I know where you're watching from? Leave a comment below and tell us which corner of the world this story has reached. We treasure every word you share. Claire blinked several times, trying to focus on the man who had stopped the glass from touching her lips. He was tall, his face carved with a sternness that felt sculpted from cold stone, his deep slate-gray eyes carrying a strange, unsettling calm, and his perfectly tailored black suit made him unlike anyone else in this bar. Not someone out looking for fun, and certainly not someone who normally interfered in strangers' troubles. But he had done exactly that. Claire stared at him, her vision slightly blurred from alcohol, her throat raw from emotions she could not name. "I don't need saving," she muttered, reaching for her drink. He didn't hand it back. He simply set it down on the counter, out of her reach. "You need water," he said, his voice low, firm, not a demand but a gentle command. A small nod to the bartender, and a moment later a cold glass of water appeared in front of her, along with a discreet glance from the bar staff. There was something in the way they looked at this man, respect, or fear, or perhaps both. Claire glanced around. The man who had been sitting beside her earlier, the one who had asked too many questions and touched her hand without permission, was suddenly gone. When she turned back, the man in the black suit had pulled out the chair next to her and sat down, keeping just enough distance, as if he didn't want to scare her but had no intention of leaving. "What's your name?" he asked, his eyes never leaving her face. Claire hesitated. Part of her wanted to ignore him, but another part, the part exhausted from holding herself together, just wanted someone to ask without pity. "Claire," she whispered. "Claire Thompson." He nodded, as if storing it away. "Julian," he said. No last name, none needed. Just that single word slowed the air around them. Claire leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment. The music, the lights, the chatter all seemed to push farther into the distance. "Do you do this often?" she asked, her voice rough. "Stopping strangers from self-destructing?" Julian paused. "Only when the person doesn't realize she's being watched." Claire opened her eyes and turned to him, but Julian's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't joking. She blinked. "What do you mean?" Julian tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but weighted. "When you lifted that third drink, a man behind you had his phone out. He took pictures of you. Before that, he was talking to someone, and he said the name Nathan." Claire sat up straighter, the fog of alcohol thinning sharply. "You heard that?" "I hear what needs to be heard," Julian replied. "And what he intended wasn't just walking you out of here." Claire swallowed hard. The cool air from the vents suddenly felt ice cold. A shiver ran through her. Julian glanced at her phone, then back at her. "I have a car waiting outside. You don't have to go far. But you shouldn't stay here." She let out a brittle, humorless laugh. "Why do you care?" Julian looked at her, his eyes steady and unmoving. "Because I've seen this too many times. And it never ends better than people think." Claire turned away, biting her lip. She didn't know who he was, but something in his voice, in the way he observed everything, made her trust his words more than those who once swore they'd never hurt her. Part of her wanted to leave. Another part feared going anywhere with a stranger. But the alcohol made her thoughts slow. Loneliness made her heart softer. And Julian's gaze felt like a quiet promise that even though she didn't fully understand what was happening, he would be the one person standing between her and whatever darkness was about to unfold. Morning light streamed through the ash-gray curtains, spilling into the wide room with its high ceilings and the faint, comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee. Claire opened her eyes slowly, her head heavy as if she had just surfaced from a dream both hazy and haunting. She pushed herself upright and realized she was lying on a large bed, white sheets crisp and smooth like something from an upscale hotel. Her clothes were still intact. Her handbag rested neatly on the chair by the window, her phone plugged into a charger. She glanced around the room. Everything was immaculate to the point of being strange. No personal belongings, no family photos, no unnecessary decoration. Everything here gave the impression of a space meant to be temporary, yet controlled down to the last detail. Claire let her feet touch the cool wooden floor and stepped out of the room with bare feet, her heartbeat steady but unfamiliar. Outside was an open living space, dark wooden floors, tall windows overlooking the Upper West Side easing into a new day. In the kitchen, Julian stood in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a cup of coffee in hand, his expression as calm as if he hadn't been up the entire night keeping an eye on her. Claire paused for a moment before speaking softly. "Where exactly am I?" Julian turned, his gaze sweeping over her briefly. Unfazed, unhurried. "Safe," he said. "That's all you need to know this morning." She stepped closer, trying to steady her voice. "You brought me here?" "I don't let someone drunk go home alone," Julian said, setting the cup on the counter. "Especially not someone being followed." Claire tightened her hand around the hem of the borrowed sleep shirt, the fabric soft, the scent unfamiliar. "Who are you really?" Julian studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly, as if deciding it was time to answer. "My name is Julian Reyes," he said slowly. "I run a few businesses in Manhattan, restaurants, real estate, some other investments." Claire frowned. What kind of business makes bartenders bow their heads at a single gesture, or makes strangers disappear with just a look? Julian didn't avoid the question. "I run everything with control. And sometimes control requires people to understand who makes the decisions." She looked at him, her heart pounding, unsure which was more dangerous, standing in the home of a powerful man she knew nothing about, or the fact that she didn't feel as afraid as she should. "Why me then?" she asked. "Why involve yourself in my life? Why not ignore me like everyone else?" Julian walked toward her slowly, stopping at a respectful distance, his eyes steady but not cold. "Because I recognize the look of someone about to get hurt," he said. "And last night, you had that look." Claire glanced down, her throat tightening. She wasn't used to being protected, and even less used to being seen so clearly. Julian handed her a glass of water without pressing. "You can leave any time," he said. "No one is keeping you here. But if you want to know why Nathan Green is tied to the men whose names I heard last night, I can help." Claire's breath caught. "You know Nathan? I know the people he's been trying to approach," Julian said, his eyes darkening. "And if he used your name in any of his dealings, those men won't care whether you're innocent or not." The air thickened. Claire sat down, both hands wrapped around the glass. One night, one drink, one unexpected rescue, and now she stood at the edge of a world she had never imagined touching. But one thing she knew for certain. If anyone understood the danger creeping toward her, it was the man standing in front of her. Claire left Julian's apartment later that afternoon, refusing the car he offered. She insisted she needed space, needed to walk on her own for a moment, needed to remind herself the outside world was still turning the way it always had. Julian didn't stop her. He only watched her with an expression she couldn't decipher whether it was concern or control. She arrived back at her small Brooklyn apartment just as the sun dipped away, the streets buzzing with their usual noise and chaos. But the moment Claire entered the lobby, the building manager called out to her with an expression she had never seen on him. "A man came looking for you this morning," he said. Claire froze. "Who?" "I don't know," he shrugged. "Tall, dark coat. First asked about Nathan Green, then asked if you still lived here. I didn't tell him anything, just said I couldn't give out personal information." Claire's heartbeat faltered. Did you see where he went? Left pretty fast. But he left a phone number. I threw it away. Claire thanked him and hurried to the elevator, that strange, unsteady feeling rising inside her, as if familiar walls had suddenly shifted. Her apartment was untouched, everything exactly as she had left it. But as soon as she closed the door, locked it, and pulled the curtains, she finally noticed her hands were trembling. After standing still for a moment, she checked her phone. No messages, no missed calls, except one. Recent call from an unknown number. No name, no notes, just the stark words, unidentified number. Claire stared at it, then set the phone down and went to the kitchen for water. But the moment she lifted the glass, her phone buzzed again. The same number. She didn't answer. A minute later, a text arrived. Claire Thompson? No greeting, no politeness, no warmth. She gripped the phone, her mind spinning. She had never been anyone's target before. Now, in less than a day, she felt watched from every shadow. She stepped to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough. The street below was the same as always, but among the pedestrians and city noise, she spotted a dark car parked across the road, windows tinted, lights off, her heart squeezed. Claire stepped back and reached for her phone. Her fingers moved by instinct, finding the number that just last night had felt far too unfamiliar. Julian Reyes. She hesitated for one breath, then called. He answered after 2 rings. You made it home? He said, his voice low, alert, as if he had never stopped being on guard. Claire swallowed. A man came looking for me this morning. Asked about Nathan. And now, I'm getting messages. They know my name. A short silence. Then Julian's voice dropped. You went home alone. I told you. I needed... No, he cut in, firm but not angry. Now you lock your door, open for no one, and don't touch your phone again. I'm on my way. You don't have to. Claire started, but he had already ended the call. She stared at the blank screen, her chest tight. Part of her wanted to prove she could handle this, that she wasn't fragile. But another part, smaller yet unmistakably honest, wanted someone, anyone to show up, knock on her door, and tell her she wasn't alone in this. And that someone, for reasons she didn't understand, was the man coming for her for the second time in less than 24 hours. A firm knock sounded 3 times, crisp, powerful, controlled. Claire checked the peephole, and her entire body finally unclenched when she saw Julian standing there beneath the warm hallway light that softened the sharp lines of his black jacket. She opened the door wordlessly and stepped back. Julian entered, his eyes scanning her apartment with a precision that felt both unsettling and strangely reassuring. Behind him, another man followed, tall, dressed in dark clothing, an earpiece in one ear, his expression cold as stone. Claire looked at him, then at Julian. You brought security? Marco, Julian said simply. He stays outside when needed. Marco gave a small nod, then slipped back into the hallway as silently as he had appeared. Julian turned to Claire. They've started looking for you. Claire backed toward the sofa, sinking onto it without noticing her own shaking hands. Why? I haven't done anything. Julian sat across from her, hands resting on his thighs, his gaze steady on her face. Because they think you're valuable. I have nothing, Claire whispered, her voice cracking. I lost my job, got betrayed. I can't even pay the wedding debt. I'm nothing. Julian didn't blink. You are the only person whose name appears on every contract Nathan signed in the past 6 months, including deals he had no right to make. Claire's eyes widened. What are you talking about? Julian took out his phone, opened a document, and handed it to her. Small text, columns of numbers, signatures, and her name at the bottom. Claire held it, her fingers going cold. I never signed this. I didn't even know he was doing business with anyone. You believe that, but the people Nathan approached don't care what you knew. They only need a name, an address, a phone number. And you're all 3. Claire set the phone down and pressed her hands to her head. Oh God. Julian didn't move. You're no longer invisible, Claire. Not since you walked out of that bar last night. You came into the line of sight of men you were never meant to cross. And if I hadn't met you, she whispered. Julian paused. Maybe you would have left with the man standing behind you last night. Maybe this morning you would have woken up somewhere no one could find you. Claire shuddered. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, colder, as if even the walls couldn't protect her. What do I do now? Julian rose, stepping toward her, stopping just short of touching. You don't go anywhere alone. You don't answer unknown numbers. If anyone shows up, friends, Nathan's people, anyone, you call me first, not the police. They can't handle men like this. Claire looked up, swallowing the tightness in her throat. What will you do? Julian held her gaze, his eyes sharp as a concealed blade. I'll clean up the mess your former fiancé left behind. She stared at him, emotions tangled. Why? I'm nothing to you. Because I saw you before they did, Julian said quietly. And I won't let an innocent person get used. Claire wanted to argue, to push back, to keep her distance. But in this small Brooklyn apartment, the man she had known for less than a day was the only one who made her feel even a fraction safer. Julian looked toward the door. You should pack a small bag, a few clothes, your documents, essentials. You're not staying here tonight. Claire remained still. I can't just leave everything like this. Julian turned back, his voice dropping. Claire, this isn't a choice anymore. This is survival. She looked at him, the ceiling light casting a tired glow across his face, showing the resolve of someone who had spoken these words to people who never understood how close danger truly was. And for the first time, Claire didn't resist. She simply nodded, a small nod, but enough for Julian to know she had begun to believe him. Claire sat in the back of the car, with her small bag resting on her lap, her fingers gripping the zipper, as if holding onto it could anchor her to the life slipping out of her grasp. The city slid past the window, streetlights stretching across her face and turning everything into a disordered dream. Julian sat beside her in silence, his gaze fixed forward, his face unreadable. But something in the way he held himself steady, controlled, vigilant, made her feel safer than any locked door ever had. As the car turned into the Upper West Side, the world grew quieter. Elegant buildings rose before them, windows glowing with warm, golden light, as if belonging to a universe she had never been part of. The car stopped in front of a tall glass building. No sign, no visible guards, yet more secure than anywhere she had ever lived. Julian stepped out first and opened her door without a word. Marco stood nearby, his eyes scanning the street without pause. Claire entered the lobby feeling as though she were stepping deeper into a chapter of her life she couldn't understand. The elevator took them to the penthouse. When the doors opened, she found herself inside a vast, modern, minimalist space. Everything radiated a kind of deliberate quiet. Wide glass panels looked out at the Hudson River shimmering under the night lights. Monochrome furnishings were immaculate, cold in a luxurious way. Julian pointed toward a door on the right. Your room is there. Everything you need is inside. The lock code is your birthday. Marco will change it if you prefer. Claire stepped into the room, which felt larger than her entire former apartment. White linens, ebony wardrobes, soft lighting like a magazine spread. She set her bag down and turned to find Julian standing in the doorway. I know this isn't easy, he said, his voice low and steady. But you need to understand. What Nathan did doesn't end with you. He crossed people I don't leave unchecked. Claire leaned slightly against the bed, her head bowed. I didn't know anything. I didn't think I mattered. Julian stepped one pace closer but didn't cross the threshold. It's not about mattering. It's about vulnerability. And in their world, vulnerable means exploitable. She looked up, her eyes beginning to fracture. I just want things to go back to normal. Julian nodded, his expression softening. And I'll do what I can to keep that within your reach. But for now, I need you to stay here. Don't go out alone. Don't answer anyone except me or Marco. You don't have to trust me completely. Just trust that I have no reason to let anything happen to you. Claire didn't speak. She only nodded. Julian turned to leave, but before the door closed, he paused, still facing away. The door locks from the inside. If you feel unsafe, lock it. But if anything happens, just call my name. I'll hear you. Then he was gone, leaving her alone in a space too quiet, too perfect, too foreign to everything she countless had ever known. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, looking out through the glass at the city lights still scattered across the skyline, but she was no longer the woman watching life from the outside. She was now in the middle of a world she once believed existed only in films, and the man who had just walked out of her room was the only thread connecting her to safety. The next morning, Claire woke to a room more peaceful than anywhere she had ever slept. Everything was tidy, clean, almost emotionless. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains without harshness, and the faint smell of coffee pulled her from the bed. When she reached the kitchen, Julian was already there in a white shirt, coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the tablet in front of him. He looked up, nodded. "Sleep okay?" Claire nodded faintly, still disoriented by the sense of living inside an alternate reality. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him. "Is something wrong?" Julian turned the tablet toward her. "I think you should see this." On the screen was a set of documents, with attachments and digital signatures. Some bore Nathan Green's name, but what silenced her was the second name beneath it, Claire Thompson. "I never signed any of this," she said, her voice thin. Julian nodded. "I know. Your signature was forged, but he used your name to legitimize several loans, some assets, even a lease contract for an office in Lower Manhattan." Claire held the tablet, her hands trembling slightly. Each line hit her like a hammer. Everything she believed about building a future together, all of it had been a trap. "Why would he do this?" she whispered. Julian tapped a finger lightly against the table. "He lost his job 3 months ago, got denied a personal loan, credit debt rising, and instead of facing it, he went to people who lend money under certain conditions." Claire looked up. "What conditions?" Julian paused. "Collateral, personal ties. He sold access to your information as part of his security package. If he failed to pay, they would come to you first." Claire felt the air thicken around her. "I didn't know. I never imagined he would do something like that." Julian leaned back. "Most people don't believe the person they love could betray them. But money makes people small. Fear makes them dangerous." She looked down, her heartbeat growing erratic. "How long have you been investigating him?" "Since the first night I took you home," Julian said plainly. "I had to know if you were a potential threat or just someone dragged into this mess." Claire tightened her grip on her cup. "And which am I?" Julian held her gaze. "You are the betrayed. But now you're also his liability. Because you're the only valuable piece left in the wreckage he made." She didn't know which hurt more, that Nathan had betrayed her, or that she was now a bargaining chip in a game she never agreed to play. "What do I do?" she whispered. Julian rose slowly. "I'll handle my part. As for you, stay here, stay quiet, and be prepared. If they think you're still connected to Nathan, they will come again." Claire watched him leave the kitchen, every step weighted, like he was carrying a battlefield she couldn't see. And in that moment, she understood her life had collided with dangers far sharper than heartbreak. Nathan hadn't just broken her heart. He had thrown her name into the hands of men who needed no reason to destroy someone. That afternoon, Claire sat alone in the apartment's reading room, trying to gather fragments of calm from the storm within her, when the doorbell rang. She startled, lifted her head, and walked slowly to the hallway. The security screen showed a middle-aged man in a gray suit, hair slicked back, wearing a smile that felt colder than the metal door. He offered no name, simply looked into the camera and spoke in a polished, unsettlingly polite tone. "I'm here on behalf of an old associate of yours, Miss Claire Thompson. Just a few minutes of conversation, nothing serious." Claire stepped back, her heartbeat quickening. She didn't know who he was, but every instinct screamed that opening the door would be a mistake, a dangerous one. Before she could react, Julian appeared behind her, soundless, wordless. He walked straight to the control panel, held down the decline button, then turned to her. His eyes were no longer calm, they were sharp and dark as forged steel. "Did you speak to anyone?" She shook her head. "I didn't talk to anyone. He just appeared." Julian didn't answer. He pulled out his phone, spoke a few clipped sentences in Spanish she couldn't understand, then hung up. He looked at her again, and this time the anger wasn't hidden. "He knows this place. That isn't a coincidence. He came to test your reaction or to see whether I'm keeping you." Claire swallowed hard. "Who is he?" Julian's jaw tightened, his voice dropping lower. "His name is Vincent Morello. He works for an old branch of the organization Nathan dealt with. They think you're still in contact. They think you can pay his debt." Claire felt her chest tighten. "I don't know anything. I have nothing to give them." Julian looked at her like he had heard this truth 100 times before, but this time it made him furious. Not at her, at the people who had put her here. He strode toward his office, and Claire followed. Inside, Julian opened a steel cabinet, pulled out a metal case, and lifted out a handgun. Claire froze. She had never seen him like this. No calm restraint, no distant composure, only a man protecting his territory against someone threatening what he considered important. He holstered the gun under his jacket and faced her. "You're not leaving this place tonight. No windows, no balcony, no lights. If you hear anything, call me. I'll be right outside." Claire tried to speak, but her throat tightened. Julian looked at her a moment longer, his voice gentler but stretched thin with tension. "Claire, they will try again. And next time won't be a polite invitation." Her legs weakened beneath her. He extended a hand not to touch, but simply offering the space between them. "If you're scared, you have every right. But if you choose to trust me completely. I can't protect you if you're still doubting me." Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and something more, something unnamed, something rising in her chest every time she met the storm in his gaze. She nodded, barely. Julian nodded back, then stepped out, leaving her alone with the half-closed door and the pounding of her own heartbeat. And for the first time, Claire wasn't only afraid of what waited outside. She was afraid of what was beginning to take shape inside her whenever she looked into Julian Reyes's furious, protective eyes. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She lay still in the dark, ears straining to catch even the faintest sound, as if a single unfamiliar noise might signal something terrible waiting just outside her sight. She didn't turn on the lights or open the curtains. Darkness was a thin blanket she could hide under, a fragile shield that made her feel safer, as if not seeing anyone meant no one could see her. But deep inside, what kept her awake wasn't just fear. It was the image of Julian, those furious eyes, that low, rough voice ordering her to lock the door, the way he reached out in the middle of chaos just to ask whether she wanted to trust him. Around 3 a.m, a soft knock sounded. Not urgent, not threatening. Claire sat up instantly, heart pounding. She stepped out of bed, cracked the door open, and saw Julian standing in the hallway, no jacket, just a dark t-shirt and simple trousers. His eyes were less tense than earlier tonight, but still carried that steady seriousness she had come to recognize. He spoke quietly, almost a whisper. "Did you sleep at all?" Claire shook her head. "No. And you?" Julian lifted one shoulder slightly. "I didn't sleep either." Silence stretched between them for a few seconds before Claire opened the door wider. He didn't step in. He simply leaned against the doorway. She looked at him, the dim hallway light casting a soft glow along the line of his nose and the sharp contours of his face, making him seem both distant and strangely close. "Have you ever thought about how one small decision can change your entire life?" Claire asked, her voice barely louder than a breath. Julian looked directly at her. "I think about that every day." She leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, as if she were trying to hold herself together. "If I hadn't gone to the bar that night, if I hadn't ordered the 3rd drink, if you hadn't taken it away from me." Julian nodded slowly. "Then you might not be here right now. Or worse." Claire exhaled softly, as if another second of silence might slow time down and help her understand the impossible shift her life had taken. "But I still don't understand why you're doing all this, why you're helping me." Julian tilted his head, and his gaze lost its cold edge. "Because I know what it's like to be betrayed, to be abandoned in the middle of a fight you didn't choose, and I couldn't leave you there." Claire said nothing, her throat tightening with something she didn't have a name for. Then she lifted her eyes to his. "You're always in control. You always know what to do. Are you ever afraid?" Julian pressed his lips together, his eyes darkening. "Yes. I'm afraid that someday I'll let someone get too close. And then I won't be able to protect them." The words dropped between them like something soft and heavy, tightening the narrow hallway around them. Slowly, Claire lifted her hand and touched his wrist. Such a simple gesture, wordless, but Julian didn't pull away. She felt the warmth of his skin, the steady pulse beneath it. "I don't know what's going to happen next," Claire whispered. "But tonight, just having you standing here, I don't feel alone." Julian looked at her for a long moment, then nodded softly. No one said another word, only shared silence. And in that moment, there were no criminals, no danger, no debts or threats. Only a man and a woman standing at the edge of their old lives, stepping into something else uncertain in shape, but growing with every breath. When Julian finally walked away, and the door closed gently behind him. Claire was no longer afraid of the dark, because now she knew someone out there was awake, watching, guarding not only out of duty, but because she had begun to matter. The next 3 days passed in an unsettling quiet. Claire adjusted to the slow rhythm of Julian's apartment, where everything operated under an invisible order she didn't need to understand, only accept. Marco was always present somewhere, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes in the basement, sometimes completely gone like a programmed shadow. Julian continued his work as usual, spending hours in his office on calls she never fully heard and poring over documents encrypted beyond her comprehension. Yet even in the calmest moments, something in the air kept her from relaxing entirely, as though this quiet was only the pause before a storm. That afternoon, when Claire stepped onto the balcony for the first time since she'd arrived, she carried a cup of hot tea, hoping she might finally claim a few minutes of privacy. From that height, Manhattan stretched beneath her like a maze of light and sound, everything distant enough to feel untouchable. But then she froze as her eyes settled on the building across the street. An apartment on the 11th floor, its dark window slightly cracked open, and behind that sliver of glass, she saw it, a small red flash blinking, then disappearing. Claire went still, her heartbeat stumbling into panic. Not a signal light, not a stray reflection. It was the glint of an electronic device, a camera lens, or a scope. She stepped back instantly, yanked the curtains shut, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped the cup. For several seconds she stood motionless in the living room, back pressed against the wall, breath shallow and rapid as if she had run across an entire block. She grabbed her phone and called Julian. He answered almost instantly. "Where are you?" he asked. "In the living room. Someone is watching from the building across. 11th floor. Left window. A red flash just appeared." Julian didn't ask a single follow-up question. He said only one thing. "Step away from the window. Now." 10 minutes later, Julian and Marco were in the apartment. No noise, no frantic movements, but tension etched into both their faces. Julian walked straight to the balcony, pulled a small pair of binoculars from his pocket, and looked toward the opposite building. Marco checked every security feed inside the apartment. Claire stood by the door, hands gripping each other so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Maybe it was just a reflection," she said, her voice unsteady. Julian didn't answer right away. When he finally turned back to her, his face was more serious than she had ever seen it. "That wasn't a reflection. It was a directional lens. Could have been a camera, could have been a scope." Claire felt the cold seep into her bones. Marco returned from the hallway. "Doors secure, but there are signs the system was scanned within the last 24 hours. Someone's probing." Julian looked at Claire. "They've found you here." Her mouth opened, but no words came. "I didn't go out. I didn't contact anyone. Julian cut her off, his voice dropping lower. "You don't have to do anything. Just existing is enough to make you a target." Claire felt the room tilt. Every wall, every lock, every camera, everything she thought could protect her, now felt paper thin. Julian stepped closer, his eyes softening with that steady pull that always seemed to anchor. "From now on, you don't leave any room without me or Marco. And if anything at all seems strange, you call immediately. Don't wait, don't guess." Claire nodded, barely. At that moment, every trace of resistance dissolved, leaving only one clear, brutal truth. They were close. And if Julian hadn't been here, if she had hesitated even for a second, that red flash might have been the last thing she ever saw. That evening, Julian's home was quiet in a way that unsettled more than it soothed. Claire sat in the living room with an open book resting before her, yet she couldn't read a single line. The image of that red glint from the building across the street lingered in her mind like a warning that everything was beginning to slip beyond control. Julian and Marco had gone downstairs to run a full check on the security system, leaving her alone for only a few minutes. But those minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. She stood and walked to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, willing her hands not to shake. But just as she turned her back, a soft metallic click echoed through the apartment, the kind of sound that could be anything or mean everything. Before she could turn toward it, every light in the apartment snapped off at once. Darkness crashed down, thick and sudden, and Claire dropped the glass, water splashing across the floor. She spun toward the door, her heart trying to break free from her chest. "Julian," she called out softly. No answer, No familiar footsteps. Nothing but the thin whisper of air seeping under the door and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She groped for her phone, but the moment her fingers brushed the screen, a hand cold as steel clamped over her mouth from behind. She was yanked backward, her spine slamming into the chest of a large man. She tried to scream, but the sound died beneath his grip. A low male voice whispered against her ear, "Don't move, or it'll hurt more." A damp cloth pressed over her, nose and mouth. The sharp, chemical sting filled her lungs and blurred her vision almost instantly. Claire struggled, reaching for anything, clawing at the air, but the darkness swallowed every attempt. There were sounds, thuds, a staggered step, a muttered curse, and then another man's voice hissed urgently, "Hurry, Reyes will be up here any second." She heard Julian's name, and in that moment, her fear twisted into a deeper, heavier dread. She tried to call to him, even in her mind, but her breath was already thinning into mist. Just before everything went black, she heard the sliding of the glass balcony door and felt cold air hit her skin. They weren't taking her out the front. They were taking her over the balcony. A rope tightened around her waist, and then she was pulled into the night, her body swallowed by an endless dark drop. When Claire woke, her skull throbbed as if shards of glass were embedded inside. The air was damp, freezing, reeking of rust and seawater enough for her to know she was far from Manhattan. Her wrists were tied behind her, the rope biting deep into her skin. Her mouth was dry and burning. Two figures stood in the corner of the dim room, illuminated by the flicker of an old yellow bulb. One of them stepped closer. Claire squinted, trying to clear her vision. A familiar voice, dripping with mockery, broke the silence. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon, Claire." Vincent Morello, the man who had appeared at Julian's door just the day before. Claire tried to retreat, but the ropes held her in place. Her breath quickened. He crouched down, smiling with cruel amusement. "You know, Reyes has been a problem for us for a while. And when a man like him has a weakness, digging into that weakness is only natural." Claire froze. I don't know anything." Vincent laughed softly. "Of course you don't. But you matter. You matter a great deal, because Nathan Green used your name on documents he should never have touched, and now Reyes is trying to clean up the fallout. We only needed one reason to make him come out of hiding." Claire's pulse slammed against her ribs. She knew what happened to people taken only to apply pressure, and it was never good. Vincent straightened. "They'll move you once the truck gets here. Just sit still. Don't do anything stupid. Still," Claire managed to whisper, her voice barely air. Julian will come." Vincent's eyes darkened for a moment. "Oh, I know. That's exactly what I'm counting on." Behind him, a metal door creaked open, a blast of cold wind sweeping in along with the deep rumble of a truck engine outside. Claire recognized the place immediately. The smell of the river, the clatter of mooring lines, the night wind slicing through every crack. This was the industrial yard near the docks, the kind of place where container trucks were left idle, the kind of place where no one questioned the sound of a scream. Two men grabbed her, each seizing an arm. Claire tried to resist, but her body was too weak to hold itself upright. As they dragged her into the biting cold, everything inside her tightened with terror. Yet beneath the fear, buried in the roar of metal and the sting of night air, one name echoed through her mind, clear, desperate, unbreakable: Julian. And all she could hope was that he would reach her before everything went too far. Julian stood frozen at the entrance of the empty living room, the warm glow of the apartment lights spilling across the floor, where water pooled from a shattered cup and muddy footprints trailed across the rug. It had taken less than 10 minutes. He and Marco had gone downstairs for a routine systems check, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. But when they returned, the apartment door showed no signs of forced entry. The alarm had never triggered, and Claire was gone as if she had never existed in the space at all. Marco crossed the room to check the security feed. Julian clenched his jaw, his eyes darkening like forged steel. He didn't need to wait for footage. He didn't need to replay anything. He knew exactly who had done this. Vincent Morello. The warning had been made. He had shown up at the door to prove he could find them, and now he had taken the only person capable of making Julian lose control: Claire. Marco returned, tension carved across his features, though he remained steady like a trained soldier. Signals were jammed 2 minutes before the power outage. Entry point was the roof. They didn't use the front door. Julian nodded, his voice dropping into something almost too low to hear. Get Salazar on the line. I want every man we have at Red Hook in 30 minutes. Marco met his eyes. You think they took her there? Julian didn't blink. They're not stupid enough to go far. They need her as bait, and they know I'll come. Marco didn't argue. He stepped aside and made the call. Julian walked into Claire's bedroom, the faint scent of her shampoo still, clinging to the blankets, the impression of her head still visible on the pillow from the night before. He stood there a long moment, fists tightening, the muscles along his shoulders and neck drawn taut like wires ready to snap. Julian wasn't a man who lost control. He had spent a lifetime being trained to calculate, to restrain, to decide with cold precision. But something about this had crossed the line he kept so carefully guarded. Claire wasn't just someone to protect. She had become a part of his world, something that, if torn away, would leave a void nothing could fill. In the weapons locker beside the steel cabinet, he opened the safe and retrieved his Sig Sauer pistol and the short blade he carried during high-risk negotiations. Every motion was exact, stripped of hesitation. Marco entered with a stack of freshly printed reports from the portable printer, license plate logs from suspicious vehicles near the building. A white, unregistered van had left the parking garage, exactly 3 minutes after the blackout, direction, toward the waterfront. Julian scanned the map of the port, eyes moving rapidly. Container Yard 17. Old, rarely used, cameras down since last year. Vincent used it before as a drop point. Marco asked how many men to pull in. Julian answered without looking up. Everyone who owes me a favor. As many as possible. While the rapid response teams mobilized, Julian pulled out a separate phone, a device with no data, used only for the most sealed communications. He dialed a short number. The man on the other end answered after 3 rings. You need me? The raspy voice asked. How bad? Julian replied with 2 words. It's her. The man didn't hesitate. I'm coming. When Julian stepped out of the apartment, the city lights shimmered around him. But none of it mattered, not compared to the darkness closing in around Claire. He didn't know where she was at that exact moment, whether she was conscious or tied up in some freezing corner, with terror choking her breath. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Anyone who laid a hand on her, anyone who tried to use her as leverage in their games, would never get the chance to try again. And tonight, Red Hook would not remain quiet. Red Hook at night was cold and damp, like a wound that refused to close. The stacked containers rose into a towering maze along the riverbank, scattered streetlights glimmering like watchful, invisible eyes. The soft thud of waves striking the pier echoed steadily, but beneath that calm surface a storm was gathering. Julian stepped out of the car with eyes sharpened like a well-honed blade. Marco and 3 others behind him, each carrying the hardened expression of men who had survived too many battles to count. No one spoke. No orders were needed. No plans had to be laid out. Every man already knew his place. They split into a triangular formation, moving silently through the narrow shadows between the rows of steel. Julian headed straight for Yard 17, where a white truck sat carelessly crooked, its front tires sunk into a smear of mud like the footprints of someone who didn't bother to cover his crimes. He signaled for a halt. A soft metallic clink sounded somewhere nearby, chains brushing against steel. He approached, heart pounding but steps as precise and cold as ever. The beam of his flashlight cut through the gap in the container's doors. Inside, Claire was tied to a steel pillar, mouth taped, eyes closed, sweat gathering at her brow. Julian heard no footsteps, but he felt them. The others were still near. And they were waiting. A faint hiss sliced through the air on his left. A gun muzzle appeared from behind a stack of crates. Julian didn't turn, only shifted just enough to let the first bullet slice past his shoulder. Marco reacted almost at the same instant, his shot cracking through the air, punching a hole through the container wall, followed by the cut-off scream of the man who had been hiding there. Julian rushed forward, kicked the lock from the container door, and in one motion pulled Claire into his arms. She couldn't even open her eyes before he lifted her and dragged her back behind a large wooden crate. She trembled violently, her mouth still covered, tears spilling from her eyes. He tore off the tape, cut the ropes around her wrists, and whispered into her ear, "You're safe now. I'm here." Claire tried to speak, but only broken sobs emerged. Julian squeezed her shoulder gently before signaling Marco to cover the rear. A barrage of gunfire cracked from the far end, Vincent's men circling from both sides to trap them. Julian drew his blade, pulled Claire close behind him, and slipped through the narrow gap between two containers toward the far edge of the yard. Marco shouted, "3 of them, 2 o'clock." Julian didn't need to look. He shoved Claire into a narrow recess behind a crate, raised his gun, and stepped out like a phantom. A shot rang out, then 2 more. One man rushed from the shadows but fell before reaching cover. The second didn't even manage to draw his weapon before Julian's fist slammed into his jaw, dropping him with a lifeless thud. The last man tried to flee but didn't make it past Marco's line of fire. In less than 3 minutes, the noise faded. Only the smell of gunpowder and ragged breaths remained. Julian returned to Claire. She sat tucked into the shadows, hands locked tightly together. When he extended his hand, she took it instantly, like a drowning woman breaking the surface. He lifted her gently, and without a word, pulled her into his arms. Claire clung to him, her face pressed against his chest, breathing in the smoke still clinging to his skin, the scent that, to her, now meant safety more than anything else. "I knew you would come," she whispered, tears soaking into his shirt. Julian said nothing. He only held her tighter, eyes scanning the darkness beyond them where Vincent's men had fallen, but the shadows remained, thick and unwilling to break. Yet in that moment, all that mattered was that she was alive, in his arms, and that was enough for him to keep fighting. The black SUV sped out of Red Hook just before 3 in the morning, leaving behind a trail of mist and the fading tang of gunpowder. Claire sat in the back seat, her fingers gripping the seatbelt, eyes fixed forward, though her mind was still trapped in the darkness where she had been held. Julian sat beside her, his broad frame blocking out half the world, his gaze locked on the navigation screen, while his hand occasionally tightened around her upper arm, as if needing reassurance that she was still there, still breathing. Back at the apartment, Marco swept through in silence to make sure everything was secure, then disappeared without needing thanks. Claire stood in the living room she had grown familiar with, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Her hand trembled as she touched the back of a chair. When she turned, she found Julian watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before, not the look of a protector, but the look of a man straining to hold back the rest of himself. She stepped forward, her legs moving before her thoughts caught up. "I didn't know. You were like that." Julian didn't reply. He slipped off his jacket, revealing a long scrape across his arm and the dried streak of blood along his sleeve. Claire moved closer and sat beside him. She reached out, intending to touch the wound, then hesitated. He didn't pull away. "It's nothing," he murmured. But it wasn't nothing. Claire knew that. Her eyes drifted down to his hand, the calloused knuckles, the faint scars that didn't belong to men who lived ordinary lives. "You've killed people, haven't you?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Julian fell silent. So silent she thought he might refuse to answer. But eventually he spoke, voice low, almost a confession. "Yes," Claire nodded slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't step back. She simply looked at him as though trying to see past the mask he had worn since the night they met. "What were you, Julian? Mafia, military, mercenary?" He met her eyes, and for the first time he didn't hide. "I was born in Havana, raised in a neighborhood where every decision meant life or death. I held a gun at 14, crossed the ocean at 18. 2 years later, I ended up working for a group in New Jersey. I learned control, how to command, how to survive, not because I wanted to, but because if I didn't, I wouldn't be here." Claire listened to every word, a strange mix of fear, sorrow, and a deepening curiosity settling inside her. "Then why did you save me?" Julian let out a soft, humorless breath. "Because you're the one thing in my life that wasn't planned." Claire moved closer still, her gaze never leaving his. "I saw who you really were tonight. I saw you kill, give orders, never hesitate. But I also saw you hold me when I was shaking. I saw your eyes when you cut me free. I saw the way you looked at me, as if losing me would take away the last piece of your world." Julian turned his face away, but she touched his cheek, guiding him back to her. "I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I'm strong enough to accept every part of your life. But tonight I know one thing. I don't want to be away from you." Julian closed his hand around hers, the first time he didn't bother hiding the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. In his eyes was everything he had never spoken aloud: regret, fear, desire to hold on to something good for once in his life. And Claire understood that no matter who he had been, tonight she had seen the truest, rawest part of him, and instead of pushing her away, it made her want to stay. The apartment lay in a strange stillness after the storm. No more distant sirens echoing through the glass. No more muted lights from the harbor brushing the windows. Only the quiet rhythm of 2 breaths filled the space where they sat side by side on the long sofa. Claire still wore her thin jacket, her shoulders trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from everything she had survived. From those moments when life balanced on the sharpest edge. From the way Julian's eyes no longer held their usual frost but something she didn't dare name. He had never allowed anyone so close, never revealed the fractures beneath the steel armor he had built around himself for years. But tonight that armor had cracked, and Claire was the one who had seen everything. Julian sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly as he stared at the floor, as if digging through the darkness inside himself to find the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as though he had been fighting a war both outside and within. "You know," he said, "I used to think I didn't need anyone. People came and went, leaving nothing but scars. I got used to staying unattached, making no promises, never letting anyone close enough to weaken me." Claire said nothing, only watched him quietly, her breathing steady but her heart straining against her ribs. His voice dropped, softer, more real. "But then you came. Not like anyone else. You didn't look at me with fear or curiosity, you looked at me with truth. You saw me, even the parts I tried to hide, and you didn't turn away. You stayed." Claire pressed her lips together, her chest full of an emotion she had no name for. "I stayed because I wanted to," she whispered. "Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I can see there's more to you than what the world believes." Julian turned to her then, their eyes meeting in a silence so tight it felt like it might break. And then, as if reaching the very edge of what he could hold inside, he spoke words even he hadn't expected to say. "I won't lose you," he said quietly. "Not because you're the only person I can save, but because you're the only one who's made me want to save myself." Claire felt her heart tighten painfully, every word cutting through to the tenderest places inside her. She had lost so much trust, love, a sense of safety, but here, beside a man covered in scars, both seen and unseen, she felt closer to something true than she ever had. "I don't know what the future looks like," she breathed. "I don't know how far I can go with you. But I know if I walked away now, I'd regret it for the rest of my life." Julian lifted his hand and touched her cheek, his fingers warm and unexpectedly gentle. Claire leaned into his palm, closing her eyes as if opening them might make the moment disappear, but it didn't. It held. And when Julian bent his head and pressed a soft, breath-like kiss to her forehead, she knew she had found something she never meant to find, yet had always hoped for. A love that wasn't perfect, not safe, but deep and painfully real. In that quiet moment, neither of them said another word. No promises, no definitions. Just the quiet presence of 2 people who finally knew they weren't alone. And Claire understood that no matter how the darkness outside might return, no matter how much blood clung to Julian's past, she was not a burden to him. She was someone he had chosen to keep with a heart that had been frozen for far too long. Only a week after the night in Red Hook, Claire and Julian left Manhattan in silence, without warning and without a trail. The gray SUV rolled away from the familiar streets before dawn fully broke, streetlights flickering in the thick morning mist. Claire sat beside Julian, clutching a small backpack with a few clothes, her notebook, and an old photograph her mother had once given her. She didn't ask where he was taking her. She didn't need to. Anywhere away from the city that haunted her, where the past clung to her like an unshakable shadow, was enough. Julian drove with a calm quiet, though his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror often, lingering when a car followed too closely. He didn't speak, but Claire knew he was still protecting her, still unable to relax. They crossed the George Washington Bridge just as the sun rose, brushing gold across the long velvet stretch of clouds. Claire turned for one last look at the city, its towers rising like memories she both loved and feared. She exhaled softly. Julian rested his hand on hers, no words needed. He understood she was saying goodbye in her heart. When they reached Maine, the sun hung high in the sky. The small lakeside town unfolded before them like a world cut from a completely different life, No honking horns, no rushing crowds, only whispering pine trees, white painted houses tucked behind wooden fences, and a still lake reflecting the whole sky. The house they came to sat hidden down a narrow path littered with dry leaves, its gray roof, slanted with age, the wooden steps gently curved from years of use. Nothing about it was luxurious or fortified with modern security. Yet the moment Julian opened the door, Claire felt her breath ease. Inside, sunlight filled every corner, the dark wood floors carrying the faint scent of old books, worn fabric, and cooling mint tea. Julian told her it was one of the safe houses he'd prepared long ago, a place no one knew about, unlisted anywhere, and most importantly, far enough for every threat to lose its trail. In the first days, Claire spent long hours on the front porch watching the lake shift with the light. In the mornings it shone blue as the sky, in the afternoons it glowed with the fire of the sunset, and at night it turned into a dark mirror studded with stars. Julian rose early, made coffee, prepared simple breakfasts. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't force her to revisit the terror. He was simply there in her sight, in the room, a quiet anchor. They didn't need many words. Everything slowed here. Even her heartbeat felt steadier. One afternoon, Claire walked alone through the pine woods behind the house. The dry leaves cracked under her feet, birds chirped somewhere above, and the resinous scent of the trees clung to the air. She realized she hadn't been able to breathe freely like this in a very long time. When she returned, Julian sat on the porch steps with an old book in his hand, the warm light of late day brushing his hair and making him look softer, younger, less burdened. She walked toward him and sat at his side. He looked up and smiled gently, his eyes no longer sharp as steel but carrying a rare peace. "I think I could stay here a bit longer," Claire murmured. Julian nodded. "As long as you want. This is your home if you choose it." Claire rested her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. Her heart still carried scars, her memory still held gunshots. But here, in a place with nothing but trees, water, the man who stayed when the world turned its back, she knew she was beginning again. Not perfectly, but truthfully, and enough. A full year had passed since Claire and Julian quietly left Manhattan behind. 4 seasons had settled over the small wooden cabin tucked between the whispering pine forest and the glass-still lake in Maine. Each season left its traces on the wooden walls, on the moss-covered fences, and on the rhythm of 2 people who had once lived in the shadows. When autumn returned, the woods turned into a blaze of gold and amber. The lake shimmered with sunlight like shards of broken glass, and Claire realized her heart had changed too. She no longer startled at sudden noises, no longer woke in the middle of the night, gasping from nightmares. Her sleep grew deeper, warmer partly because of the quiet of this place, and partly because of the familiar warmth beside her. Julian had learned to let the days slow down. He no longer answered calls after midnight, no longer hid weapons behind the door. He rose early, brewed coffee for them both, walked with Claire along the lakeshore, and sometimes spent hours repairing an old wooden chair or reading a worn novel he had brought with him from Cuba. They didn't speak of the past anymore. They didn't need to. Their memories had settled like dust at the bottom of the mind, never erased, but no longer stirring the surface. One early October morning, Claire woke before sunrise. She stepped onto the porch, the autumn chill reddening her nose. The lake in the distance was blurred with mist, but it no longer felt cold or foreign the way it had the day she first arrived. Holding a cup of hot tea, she gazed toward the forest and smiled to herself. Her hands no longer trembled. She had begun writing again. The first lines had been difficult, like pushing upstream through heavy water. But slowly, the words rose from inside her. Not to forget, but to remember, to understand that no matter how deep the hurt, people can still rise from the rubble of their own lives. Julian stepped behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting gently on her shoulder. He didn't need to ask what she was thinking. They had grown comfortable in quiet moments like this. "How far along are you?" he asked softly. "Almost done with the final chapter," she said, turning toward him, her eyes catching the pale pink of dawn glowing through the trees. "I think it's time to let a story end, so I can begin a new one." Julian smiled, a rare smile she had once thought impossible. "There's no rush. We have all the time in the world." She leaned into his chest, inhaling the scent of pine and of him, familiar and safe. She knew there were still secrets he hadn't spoken, that there might still be people out there who wanted to drag him back into the darkness. But here, in this quiet corner of Maine, in a nameless cabin no one knew, they had built a world of their own, not perfect, but enough to live, enough to love, and enough to believe that sometimes what we need most isn't a life free of danger, but someone willing to walk with us through the broken pieces. A year earlier, she had walked into a Manhattan bar just to forget. Now, she sat on the porch of a home she never expected to find, writing the last lines of the first story she truly wanted to tell, not about pain, but about how people find light even when the past is dark. Claire sat in the small attic room she had turned into her writing nook, the angled window casting soft light across the walls and onto the antique typewriter Julian had restored for her from a second-hand shop in town. On the desk lay stacks of neatly folded pages, each one a step forward, a fragment in the journey of rewriting her life. She had never imagined becoming a storyteller, and certainly not that her first story would be her own. But the more she wrote, the more she understood that some things need to be faced not to erase them, but to look back with gentler eyes. In those early Maine days, Claire could barely finish a paragraph. Her emotions overflowed, but her words dried up. She feared that writing everything down would reopen the wound, hurt Julian, or pull her back into the pit of memory. But one morning, seeing Julian patiently repairing a bookstand for her, attentive to the smallest detail, she realized she wasn't writing to escape anymore. She was writing to live. The book she finished didn't have a glamorous title. It didn't begin with love, and it didn't end with a wedding. It began with a broken woman in a bar and a man who approached her without a promise, placing a hand over her third drink and saying no. It told the story of a woman who once believed she was invisible, and a man who thought he had lost the human part of himself until he found light in the most fragile presence. When Claire sent the manuscript out, she didn't expect it to be published. She only wanted to contain the story in a complete form, placing a period at the end of one chapter of her life. But one winter afternoon, while she baked in the kitchen and Julian chopped wood outside, an email appeared from a publisher with a line that made her knees weaken. "We've read your manuscript, and we believe the world needs this story." Claire stood still, the phone shaking in her hands, her eyes fixed on that single sentence before she stepped outside to where Julian stood in the cold. He looked up, saw the emotion on her face, and set down the axe at once, walking toward her. "I did it," she whispered, placing the phone into his hand. Julian read the message, silent for a long moment before pulling her into his arms, snow thickening around them in the quiet forest. Claire never expected to become a famous writer, but she understood now that by telling her story, she had freed the part of her soul that had been locked away for years. She hadn't written to relive the pain, but to transform it. She had lived through loss, betrayal, and terror, and instead of letting it define her, she used it as the raw material for a beginning. She wrote about the woman she had been, through the eyes of the woman she had become stronger, freer, and finally learning to love herself the way Julian had once silently loved her. When the book was published, it didn't cause a sensation, but it reached thousands of readers, women who had been betrayed, men who had lost themselves and were trying to return, people who believed they were unworthy of being seen. Claire read each message with tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. She knew then that she hadn't just rewritten her story, she had opened a door for others to believe that no matter how shattered the past, you can begin again. Without glory, without perfection, only truth and courage. That night the cold arrived earlier than usual, the wind threading through the pine branches and tapping against the window pane like the familiar whisper of winter, coming too soon. Claire sat in her usual armchair by the fireplace, her newly released book lying open on the coffee table, its cover showing the silhouette of a woman standing alone in the middle of a city. Julian sat a few steps away, a glass of red wine in his hand, the fire casting warm amber streaks across his face. They had spent a quiet day together, taking a walk around the lake, sharing a simple dinner, then sitting side by side the way they often did without needing to speak. Yet inside Claire, something tugged at her, a question that had lived beneath her ribs for a long time, never spoken aloud. She lifted her eyes to him, noticing the few silver strands that had grown in his hair since the first time she saw him in that bar years ago. He was still Julian, the man whose cold, commanding gaze once made others obey without question, but he was also the one who had touched the most wounded part of her with a gentleness she never imagined he possessed. Claire rested her hands on her knees and spoke slowly. What if you hadn't come to the bar that night? Julian paused for a heartbeat, as if her question had opened a door inside him he had fought to keep closed. He turned toward her, his gaze steady and quiet, and did not rush to answer. Claire did not retreat from her words. She needed to know, not to change anything, but to understand the pieces of fate that had shaped everything. Julian set his glass down, clasped his hands, and the firelight shimmered in his eyes like memories rekindling. He spoke slowly, his voice low and honest. Maybe you would have taken that drink, and another after it. Maybe you would have gone home alone, drunk, sad, waking up to another long day just like all the ones before. Or maybe you would have met someone else, or no one at all. He paused, drawing a deep breath. But if I hadn't gone to that bar, I'm not sure how much longer I would have held on to whatever was left of the human part of me. I didn't go there for work. I didn't go with a plan. Something pulled me there, as if something was calling me toward that place. And then I saw you. You were like a small fracture in my world. Fragile, almost invisible. But for some reason, I saw you before I saw everything else. Claire's breath caught. She had heard him speak of violence, of shadows, of deals made in rooms where emotion had no use. But this was the first time he spoke about himself not as a man in control of everything, but as someone who had once stood at the edge of a cliff no one else could see. She smiled faintly, her voice tinged with emotion. I always wondered, too, if I hadn't gone out drinking that night, if I had stayed home, if I had tried to forget in some other way, maybe I would still be living a life that felt empty. Not because you saved me, but because you made me see myself through the eyes of someone who had known loss. I thought I was weak, forgettable, not worth keeping. But then you showed up not with promises, just by being there. And that changed everything. Julian stood, walked to her, and knelt to take her hand gently. Sometimes things don't happen to teach us a lesson, he said softly, but simply to bring us to where we're meant to be. If I hadn't gone to that bar, maybe we wouldn't have met. But maybe, somehow, someday, I would have found you anyway. Claire looked at him, her eyes holding everything words could not. Outside the window, the first snowflakes began to fall soft and white, as if the universe had chosen that exact moment to close one chapter and open another. And suddenly, the question that had once felt so heavy no longer needed an answer. They were here, together, and that was enough. Later, Julian and Claire sat side by side beneath the late autumn sunset, the fading light slipping through the pines like a quiet golden curtain falling over their backyard. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her fingers wrapped around his rough but warm hand, and a feeling rose in her chest that she couldn't name. It wasn't the temporary calm of a hiding place, it was true peace, the kind that comes when a heart has accepted its wounds and chosen to stay, to grow, to heal. Claire had once lived in fear of being abandoned, betrayed, unseen. Julian had spent a lifetime inside the armor of a man who didn't believe in feeling anything at all. Yet these two people who had both once shut their hearts found each other not through grand declarations but through the quiet way they listened to each other's pain and stayed even when the world had once turned its back. Julian had once said their love wasn't safe. Claire knew that better than anyone. Their love wasn't shaped by romantic trips or bouquets of flowers. It had been forged in near losses, in midnight sighs, in wordless glances when old ghosts resurfaced. It was real precisely because it wasn't safe. Real love was seeing someone's broken pieces and wanting to hold them anyway. It was knowing they could hurt you and still choosing to trust. It was growing together through storms and returning to each other afterward, again and again. Claire looked at Julian and realized she needed nothing else to feel whole. Not a grand proposal, not a fairy tale ending. Their love was complete simply because it was true, and perhaps that was all this life ever needed. The story of Claire and Julian was more than a romance between two wounded souls. It was a lesson in forgiveness, in trust, and in healing. That all of us, at some point, lose our way or lose something dear, but if we are brave enough to face the darkness and gentle enough to take another hand, we always have a chance to begin again. To everyone watching this video, how did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of something in your own life, something you once lived through, hid away, or never found the courage to speak about? Please share your thoughts in the comments. We would be honored to listen. Every story opens a door not just for its characters, but for those who read and hear it. And if you found meaning in this journey, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it with those you love. Every share helps us bring more heartfelt, honest stories to life. We hope what you heard today was more than just a piece of entertainment. We hope it helped you reflect on yourself and remember that imperfect love is still love worth holding on to. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this journey. We wish you good health, joyful days, and a peaceful heart filled with love. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.